Welcome, ladies and gentlemen, to Truth on the Tracks. I'm Brandon Turbeville, your host. For those of you who are just joining us tonight for the first time, you can catch Truth on the Tracks here every Monday night and Friday night at 9 p.m. Eastern Standard Time here on ucy.tv. You can access the show's personal webpage at ucy.tv/TT for Truth on the Tracks. And you'll find on that page, you'll find the chat room that's available. You'll find the archive versions of the show. And you'll find the RSS feed to my articles. So the articles as they're posted on BrandonTurbeville.com. Also, if you're interested in following my work, then go to activistpost.com. That's where I write most of my articles. Also, the antimedia.org. And Irrelevant Paradigm Media now is a new website that I'll be writing for. But if you're interested in my work specifically, then please go to BrandonTurbeville.com, and that is the website where I repost all of my articles, all of the YouTube videos, the interviews that I do, and the archive versions of my show. So tonight, I will not be getting into a number of different topics. Tonight I have a guest, and my guest is Mimi Laham. She is also known as Syrian Girl. She has a YouTube channel where her handle is Syrian Girl Partisan. And she has a website, syriangirlpartisan.blogspot.com. You can also follow her on Twitter. Her Twitter name is Partisan Girl, so find her there. Most of my listeners will probably know who she is. So Mimi, welcome to the show.
Hi, thank you for having me.
Yeah, no problem. It's an honor to have you on and finally be able to speak with you about some of these issues. And you just had an article posted, and I should mention to the listeners that we're recording this on November 11th, a few days in advance of when they're going to be hearing this, so bear that in mind. But you just had an article posted on SputnikNews.com, The Root Cause of a Syrian Crisis, a Syrian Perspective, and you talk about a number of different issues, and we're going to get into some of those things, but just kind of give us an overview. I mean, basically you're talking about how this Syrian crisis developed, and I guess one of the first things I want to ask you is to give the listeners kind of an overview of what Syria was like before 2010, before death squads started indiscriminately killing people in the streets.
Well, actually, my headline for the article was a little bit, on short notice. I kind of wish I was more specific in that what I really discussed is how the rise of ISIS in Syria wasn't just an accident or a mistake of US foreign policy, but a planned decision to create it. And in the first part, I tried to bring about the picture that Syria hasn't always been this way. 3 years ago, ISIS beheading people in the streets, or even any group of the insurgency, whether it be the FSA and Jabhat al-Nusra, who also behead people in the streets. Events like that would have been unthinkable. It would have just never happened. And I suppose living in the West, I can sort of see that it might be difficult for people here to imagine that a country can descend into chaos and barbarism on such short notice. It might be easier to just think about these Middle Eastern countries as always being in turmoil and always, having these medieval people enacting medieval laws there. But in fact, Syria was a very modern, secular, civilized country that had thousands of years of history. Where the origin of phonetic languages comes from. We had industry. We you name it. I mean, whatever Europe had, we basically also had. We didn't really, maybe not on the scale of advancement as some countries, but we were okay. It was a very nice, beautiful country to live in, and now it's destroyed.
Yeah, that's unfortunately, a response that I get from a lot of people that you talk to, that don't really understand the situation that the Middle East was in, and particularly Syria was in before before the crisis really began, is that you get the response, well, they've been fighting each other for 1,000 years, and that's actually not true. They've actually been fighting each other for about 3 years, and they're really not fighting each other. It's not generally Syrians who are fighting. There's an awful lot of Saudis and Libyans and Yemenis, I believe, are actually at the top of the list for, or Tunisians. I'm sorry, not the Yemenis, but Tunisians are
Yeah.
at the top of the list for fighters in Syria trying to overthrow Assad.
Absolutely. That is what I hear a lot, actually, maybe on YouTube comments, which might not be a reflection of intelligent society, but many people just sort of, brush it off as, oh, these barbarians, they've always just been murderers. Why do we interfere with them? Actually, your intervention is what caused the barbarism. It's the US go government policy of supporting extremist groups that has resulted in the rise of extremist groups. It's the Iraq War that brought Al Qaeda to Iraq. You know, these countries and these people and the societies were just like your society only a few months ago, not let alone years. So it's kind of frustrating to see that when your nation has been the victim of this injustice.
Yeah, and not to veer too far off of topic here, but I did an interview a while back with a Palestinian man who lives here in the United States, but he's 82 years old and he lived in Palestine before the Israeli state was officially set up. And you get these responses from people as well about Palestine, that it was basically, this one big desert with very savage barbarians, and Israel went in and brought democracy and civilization to them. And what you find out is that no, Palestine was modern, and it had many of the things that the West had. And all of that's gone now. Now it's a ghetto because of what the Israelis have done. But a lot of people were really, I imagine, shocked to hear that no, it wasn't just some savage barren desert that was colonized by civilized people. It was quite the opposite, actually. Um,
It's interesting, even if it were uncivilized, even if, they lived a tribal life, for example, the way that the Native Americans lived, does that mean it's okay to exterminate people and take over their land? That's the kind of that's what the meaning of making up these lies about it having no civilization. It's the intention to convince people that so long as, a nation is not as technologically advanced as you, that means it's okay to slaughter them all and take their land. Which in the first place, I don't agree with.
right. It's not civilization if you're slaughtering people. That's the opposite of civilization. Yeah. So
Exactly.
the there's a couple of other things I wanted to ask you about. You did a video a while back on YouTube. I think the title was "The Reasons Why the NWO Hates Syria," and you had about 5, 6 reasons why. And one of them was a state-owned central bank. Essentially, they did not have a Rothschild central bank. Can you tell us a little bit about some of these reasons?
Well, I'm absolutely right. I mean, Syria's central bank isn't linked to the Rothschild central bank. They control sort of their own currency and the inflation. And the thing that happened in Libya, one of the first things that happened is that Libyan bank system was also, I believe I read articles that suggested that they were linked to the Rothschild central bank as soon as the Libyan government was overthrown. And it's just it's not the main cause, but it is one of the objectives of overthrowing these governments is that they're not playing ball as part of the global elite sort of control over monetary resources in the world.
Yeah, that is interesting about Libya. These rebels are quite clever. They're able to overthrow Gaddafi, and within a matter of weeks, they managed to create a central bank, which we're all always told you need skilled bankers to create. I guess maybe I wonder if the skilled bankers were involved in that. But yes,
I wonder.
Syria's central bank, of course, is state owned, and that is a finger in the eye of the Rothschild network. I mean, here in the United States, we have the Federal Reserve, which uh, is not federal; it's private, and this allows the banks to control private banks to control interest and monetary policy. That is not the case in Syria, and there's a couple of other countries. I think Iran is one of them, and Cuba is another. There's a few others, and conveniently, they're all on the U.S. NATO hit list. The the other issue was non-GMO. Syria is not full of GMO food, right? Like the United States and Canada and the
Well,
West.
it's always sort of been a policy not to have any genetically modified food, but it wasn't put in writing until actually after the civil war began. And I think that was in part because the Syrian government was aware that after the Iraq war, new contracts were signed that were drawn up by Bremer and actually were put into the Iraqi constitution that dictated to Iraqis that they need to buy genetically modified seed, that a percentage of their seed, like they have to pay a tax to genetically modified seed. And companies like Monsanto that create genetically modified seeds and put these laws into practice basically just want to control the world's food supply. And that means that, in the Iraqi constitution, Iraqi farmers could not collect their own seed. The seed, after cycling through, a harvest, usually farmers collect their seed and then replant it for the next year. Um, and the process is free. However, if the seeds belong to Monsanto by patent, they have to destroy those seeds and pay Monsanto for every time they need to replant seeds. And that brings, the whole nation's food under the control of Monsanto and all of these other companies that create the genetically modified food. It's not about feeding the world, and it's not even necessarily about poisoning the world. It's about controlling the world resources and starving people out and not giving people, the right to control their own profit and food. And Syria was aware of that, and so new laws were enacted, even though there was no genetically modified food prior. Laws were put into place that no genetically modified food or seeds will be bought in Syria. And so no matter what happens, if God forbid, Syria is overtaken by global hegemony and they try to enact these laws, hopefully it will make news the fact that they're repealing anti-GMO laws.
Yeah, that was something that I only found out recently about the genetically modified food laws, and of course we've been eating it here for the last 20 years publicly, and it's amazing that the U.S. can actually go in and conquer and defeat anything as unhealthy as we are. If you look at the American population, you'd be surprised that we could do that. Um, the other thing, of course, we mentioned the secular government. That Syria was, Assad has been painted as this Alawite sectarian, that he, is oppressing Sunnis and all other religious minorities in Syria. But the truth is, Assad is Alawite, but the government was entirely secular. Am I correct?
Well, Baathism, which is the ideology of the government, is, a-religious in its ideology. The president happens to be Alawite, and you could argue that there's nepotism. There's some, solid evidence for nepotism everywhere among certain tribes or people. But the Alawites in Syria, you're painted this picture like they all live in mansions where everybody else are just, downtrodden peasants. But in fact, most of the vast majority of Alawites in Syria are poor peasants that live in villages just like everybody else. And they have sort of been victimized by the US media because they wanted this at the core of it to create a sectarian conflict. I remember 10 years ago, during the Iraq War, when the mainstream media was talking about how the US was trying to avoid a civil war in Iraq and how civil war in Iraq could happen, and it's such a worry. And during a time when, the Iraqi people were actually united against the occupation. But as a matter of fact, 100% the opposite of the case was that the US policy in Iraq was try to instigate as much uh, sectarian conflict as possible. And the evidence of that is seen in the constitution that federalized the states. It's seen in the fact that the Shiites were supported into power more than the Sunnis were by the occupation, just to cause a conflict there. The death squads, like the Badr brigades, that went around executing and torturing people based on sect, were supported by the United States. There's a lot of evidence to suggest that they really, really pushed hard for sectarian war. And why is that? Well, if you look at what the think tanks have been saying, like the Brookings Institutes and many others, that they want to create a new Middle East. As Condoleezza Rice coined the term, they want to balkanize the Middle East and create new states based on sect. And the reason for that is they want to destroy the concept of nationality and basically leave these countries in constant religious war with each other. So that, instead of standing up for their rights, they'll be too busy the Alawite state versus the Sunni state, etc., etc. That is what they created in Iraq, and that's what they've created in Syria, and it wasn't an accident.
Yeah, it wasn't an accident. In fact, a lot of these death squads that went on a rampage inside of Iraq were not only facilitated by the United States, but some of them were actually organized and trained. John Negroponte was involved in that, and his pupil, Robert Ford, was also involved in that in Iraq, and he moved on to be the U.S. ambassador to Syria before Syria had to kick him out for rounding up and organizing death squads in Damascus.
Yeah, and Egypt was the clever one, actually, that refused to accept him as an ambassador
It's
because they
about time.
saw that every single country he goes to has a civil war. And it was a very crucial moment for Egypt where, it could have potentially become a civil war because of the overthrow of the Muslim Brotherhood.
Yeah, and that's another prime example of the Western reporting and trying to paint someone who is actually, for all of Egypt's government's faults, but who is trying to oppose actual fundamentalist domination. When you had a Morsi who was actually trying to commit the Egyptian army to war with Ethiopia and Syria, and thank God the military was able to step in. The other point that you made in the video, which is of particular interest to me, is the question of secret societies. You stated in the video that secret societies are openly discussed in Syria, and that's a particular interest to me. How openly is this discussed in Syria, and what?
I think it's basically accepted as the status quo. It's not even questioned as um, not being fact that that the Freemasons especially exist. Of course, there's a lot of conspiracy theories about the Syrian government itself being connected to the Freemasons, and I haven't actually really deeply looked into that. But the, the point that I was making in the video is that the idea of the existence of secret societies is not something that is ridiculed in Syria. It's actually just widely accepted and believed as fact. And it is a fact. I mean, these secret societies do exist, and they do pass power between each other. That's how so many Masons became US presidents. That's how the whole world sort of works, by cabals of people passing power to each other.
Yeah, why do you think that is, particularly in Syria, that this is accepted, where in other places it's considered conspiracy theory just to say things like the Bilderberg Group actually exists? Uh,
I
what?
think Syria in particular, even there was a US sort of intelligence report that was made public. So if you go on public intelligence, you can go see this. It's the US guide to the Syrian people. And one of the main things that they said was conspiracy theory in Syria is just a part of their society. And it's a fact, Syrian people are just very open-minded to the possibility of conspiracies. I think that's because our media sort of didn't try to suppress our questioning minds. We didn't live in that suppressed kind of Western environment where they dictate to you, what you need to believe. People question the world that they're in. They're more aware of history because the countries existed, for thousands of years. We're sort of maybe have more examples to compare to. So I, that could be the explanation for it. Maybe it's just intrinsic to our society. Unfortunately, though, if you do read the Public Intelligence U.S. Guide to the Syrian People, what they actually recommend is that the conspiratorial mind of the Syrian people be exploited by feeding them false conspiracy theories. For example, the conspiracy theory that the Syrian government is actually secretly working with the U.S. and Israel, and the more recent conspiracy theory that the US has tried to feed not only the Syrian people, but who, of the rebel supporting variety, or even the US people by saying that Assad is in fact secretly behind ISIS. So, this is just the US, it seems, government is allowed to make conspiracy theories. The US media is allowed to create conspiracy theories about ISIS using Ebola as a biological weapon. But if you're on the alternative media and you dare to mention at all that Ebola is a biological weapon, then you're a lunatic.
Yeah, that was I've actually discussed that here on the show, particularly the question of the claims that Assad was behind ISIS, which were ludicrous to begin with, but then the claims, of course, that ISIS is producing oil and then selling it to Assad, and then Assad is then using that oil to attack ISIS, and nobody decides that this is maybe a bad idea for one or both parties. And I think the idea is that ISIS takes over oil pipelines and refineries and then extracts the oil and then sells it back to Assad, who pays money to ISIS that he's fighting. So ISIS sells him oil so he can use the oil to go fight. It makes a lot of sense. Of course, I'm being sarcastic. It doesn't make any sense. But yeah, I want to ask you about that as well. But before we do, I want to jump back to the issue of chemical weapons, because you were one of the few people who were speaking out about this agreement that was made regarding the Syrian chemical weapons stockpile. And most people were happy to see that the chemical weapons surrendered, but you thought that this was a bad idea. This
Yeah.
might weaken Syria's position. And if you could explain that, why did you think that was a bad idea?
You first thing is you have to acknowledge that there's propaganda on both sides of any war. And to feed us the idea that giving up something that we spent decades to build and millions and billions of dollars to build for a very legitimate reason, which is as an answer to Israel's nuclear weapons program, in order to, create a deterrent against Syria getting invaded or nuked, to say that giving them up is somehow a victory. I'm not going to swallow that immediately because I was built to question. And that's what some people on our side were trying to paint it as. We made the US stand down. all we had to do, Russia was so clever to trick the US into accepting this deal. No, here's how it is. The Syrians had a weapon in their hand that would defend against invasion and intervention, and that was the chemical weapons. And the US wanted them gone, not in 2011, not in 2012, but in 2004, and probably even before that, since the 80s. And they actually approached the Syrian government back then, same time as they approached Gaddafi, same time as they invaded Iraq, saying, if you don't give up your chemical weapons like Saddam did, we're going to invade you just like we invaded him. And, Gaddafi fell for it, and the Syrian government actually rejected it and said, yes, we will give up chemical weapons so long as Israel gives up nuclear weapons. And they put this to the United Nations, and it was shot down by the United Nations. So we saw the results of what happened in Libya and what happened in Iraq when they gave up their deterrent. So why should it be any different when Syria gives up their deterrent? And I think what Syria did was invest its hope in defense of sovereignty to Russia. And my reasoning is, why would any nation put its fate in any other nation's hands? You have to put your own fate in your own hands. You have to be independent as much as you possibly can, and basically stand up for yourself, because it's not a very clever thing to do, to put your fate in somebody else's hand, even if it's an ally like Russia. And the fact that Syria did get rid of their chemical weapons is giving in to exactly what the US wanted, because at that time in 2013 in August, the US would have rather, of course, Syria give up its chemical weapons than them having to have an all-out war where those weapons could possibly be used against Israel, and now as a result, the US, just as I said they would, have found an excuse to intervene, and I don't think it would have been possible without getting rid of those weapons.
Yeah, and these weapons really, because of the proximity to Israel, did serve as a deterrent, because whether it would have happened or not, in the event of an invasion, it was possible for Syria to lob these chemical weapons over to Israel, and that is really the major danger that was trying to be avoided, I believe, on the part of the U.S. They wanted to make sure that Israel would have been safe. That being said, actually, we're about to come up on the break, so I want to ask you this question on the other side. So tonight my guest is Mimi Al-Laham. Her website is SyrianGirlPartisan.blogspot.com. Her YouTube channel is Syrian Girl Partisan. That's her YouTube name, and her Twitter handle is Partisan Girl, so please go check that out. Ladies and gentlemen, we'll be right back after this. Stay with us.
Well, Wolf, just 2 months ago, President Obama was slammed for saying he didn't have a strategy yet for Syria. Now the president seeking to review a plan for Syria, including the eventual removal of Syrian President Bashar al-Assad. The president and his advisor is coming to the realization you are not going to defeat ISIS without a plan to get rid of Assad, who the U.S. and many of the allies see as the reason ISIS has been able to gain strength in the country. It's really an admission the initial strategy to confront ISIS in Iraq first and then take on Syria was a major miscalculation.
The United States says that it won't make any coalitions with the government of Syrian President Bashar al-Assad against the ISIL group.
For us to then make common cause with him against ISIL would only turn more Sunnis in Syria in the direction of supporting ISIL and would weaken our coalition. There's no expectation that we are going to, in some ways, enter an alliance with Assad. He is not credible in that country.
For more news, visit pigminews.com.
This is Ozzy Skateboard, and you're listening to UCY.tv.
Welcome back, ladies and gentlemen, to Truth on the Tracks. I'm Brandon Turbeville, your host. Before the break, we were talking with our guest tonight, Mimi Laham. Her YouTube channel is Syrian Girl Partisan, so please go check that out and subscribe. Her website is syriangirlpartisan.blogspot.com, and her Twitter handle is Partisan Girl, so go check all of those out. And I have to say that her Twitter page and the Facebook page are excellent sources of information if you want to find out what's going on in Syria in virtually real time. Some of the news that's hot off the press, then you should check out the social media pages. So before the break, Mimi, we were discussing the Syrian chemical weapons surrender. You didn't think was a very good idea, and I agree with that. Actually, I don't think that this death of 1,000 cuts that Syria is experiencing here, left and right. I don't think this is a great strategy. Of course, I'm not exactly positive what the other outcome could have been, but this was largely brokered by Russia at the very last minute, and this begs the question that I wanted to put to you. Everything that we've seen so far has indicated, obviously Russia is a major ally of Syria. Russia has a naval base in Tartus. Russia obviously has an alliance with Syria and Assad, and it has interests in Syria. Everything that we've seen so far has indicated that this is a strong alliance, the Russian vetoes in the UN Security Council and so forth. But in the end, do you think Vladimir Putin is really a friend of Syria? We've just seen a call that was these were reports by Mint Press, right? That Russia has now put out a plan for a transitional government in Syria that would include not only Assad's secular government representation, but also representation of the opposition. And I put the opposition in quotes because this is presented as moderate opposition, but I've been looking for moderate opposition since I've been following the Syrian crisis, and I've yet to find any. But what do you think Putin is really a friend of Syria to the end here?
I think Putin is a friend to Russia to the end, and that's his job. He's looking after Russian interests, and it's not always the case that Syrian and Russian interests align, even though they're strong allies. Russia and the US are both nuclear countries, and they try to suppress other countries from building nukes. That would mean that if the country has nuclear weapons, it's basically become very independent. So in Russia's terms, why would Russia want a independent ally? Rather, they would prefer an ally that would be completely obedient. And Syria getting rid of its chemical weapons, the WMDs, just allows Russia to gain more influence over Syria and put Syria closer into Russia's palms. That would be, Russia's interest in that. And, it's like if a guy has a gun to your head, and you have a gun in your hand, and he says, if you let go of your gun, I won't shoot you in the head. And your friend says, you better give him the gun. Is that really a friend? Well, to some level, maybe that friend promises you protection or something, but I think, you should be a friend to yourself first, as I said before. In terms of a transitional government, I'd have to look at the fine print of such a thing. But I don't think that, even there's always been a possibility of some kind of a compromise. But, I don't think the United States actually wants a compromise so much as I'm talking, of course, about the US government. They don't really want a compromise so much as perpetual war and the complete collapse of the Syrian military and the Syrian state. And though they may, be pushing the line that they want negotiations, etc., etc., they're not going to accept anything other than complete control. At least Saudi Arabia is not going to accept anything other than, getting rid of the president and the old guard and the Ba'ath Party and installing their guy, which is Jarba. And he's not even completely Syrian, he's half Saudi. So, yeah.
Yeah, yeah, that definitely is an open attempt by Saudi Arabia, which actually brings up the next question I wanted to ask you. We've seen over the last week or so, we've seen a number of attacks inside Saudi Arabia by death squads, terrorists, ISIS or ISIL as they're getting called in different places, all the same thing. But we've actually seen attacks inside Saudi Arabia recently, and that begs the question. I mean, I've always had the suspicion, and I'm under the firm belief that Saudi Arabia is just another big pawn in this situation. I mean, the Saudi royal family are really just I don't know how to put this, but they were nothing. There's nothing royal about them. They're just nomads who were put in place by the British. But they're not particularly powerful people, except as acting as pawns of the West. So I've always had the strong suspicions that these guys will actually be used to destroy countries like Iraq and Syria, and then on to Iran, and then once they're used for that purpose, then they themselves will face the color revolution and destabilization.
I completely agree. Completely agree. And you need only listen to the voices of the think tanks who suggest that Saudi Arabia too can be divided, and it's all there drawn out on a map. Hijaz can be separated from Riyadh, and they basically are pawns. And Turkey too is a pawn in this. I mean, if you look at what's happening right now, the Obama administration is turned on Turkey, and now suddenly we're all being told the truth that has been known to us for the last 3 years. But now suddenly the media has become aware of it, that Turkey is supporting ISIS. And why do we learn this now? Because they're opposing the Kurds, and the US wants to create a Kurdistan, and Erdogan opposes this policy, and now there's a clash. But they're all pawns, and they're playing along with the game. And to one day, this guy's the enemy, the next day the other guy's an enemy, and it's just divide and conquer all the way until there's nothing left, basically.
Yeah, it's funny that a few years ago there were some of us saying even then that when we knew that Turkey was playing along with the United States to overthrow Assad, that stupid Erdogan was actually going to end up creating a Kurdistan for himself. And I guess Erdogan had been promised I guess some type of bigger empire or something in his region, but not going to get it. He's got Kurdistan, and that is that's what you get for playing along with that, I guess. So enjoy
exactly.
It. But what do you think about the creation of Kurdistan? Because a lot of people ask the question, well, why is that a bad thing? I mean, most of these borders were drawn up by Britain to begin with, Britain, the British and the French.
Well, on that point of the borders being drawn up by the British and the French, people cite that and say, well, Syria is not a real country because its borders are fake and they're drawn up by the British and the French. Well, actually, Syria has existed in name since the Roman times and even before that. And its borders, maybe they weren't as rigid as since the nation states have been created, but then neither were the borders of Europe. But nobody questioned that the Germanic people existed. And no one also should question that the people of the Levant existed and do exist. Except that the only way I would agree that the borders are not correct is that the Syrian state actually traditionally was bigger. It included Lebanon and included Antakya, where there's many people who still speak Syrian in those areas. So some would also say that it includes Palestine. But I'll just leave it at Lebanon and Antakya. As for Kurdistan, there exists a Kurdish people, and they speak Kurd, and they're a different ethnicity to Syrian people. They look different as well. There are Kurds, though not just in the north region, but there are Kurds in Damascus, and some of them carry Syrian citizenship, and those would be Syrian Kurds. Now, in terms of a Kurdistan, I think, as a nationalist, I can understand and respect people's desire to have their own state, but the way in which one goes about gaining that state is also important. I see many Kurds that are more than willing to align with Zionists, and become allies to Zionists, be used as pawns and accept US weapons and US help, etc. Well, isn't it kind of hypocritical for them to ally with the same people who have stolen another people's land, another people without a nation, the Palestinian people? I mean, if there's so much support for a Kurdish state, but there's hardly any support for a Palestinian state in the U.S. media. That's quite ironic. And finally, sometimes the Kurdish nationalist is somewhat a little bit more arrogant about how much land he wants to take. He in areas of Iraq, instead of which may have been traditionally Arab Iraqi land, they'll claim that these areas are actually Kurdish, and they'll kick all the Arabs out of it. Same thing for Syria. There's parts of that. I've seen a map of a proposed Kurdistan that includes Aleppo. It's really ridiculous because the vast majority of people there have nothing to do with Kurds. So there are limits, I think, and things within reason where the vast majority of Kurds are in Turkey, and many of them fled eastern Turkey into Syrian land and Syrian areas, and we accepted that. But why are the Kurdish states being created everywhere else but Turkey? And that just comes down to the might is right, and Zionists basically, they want a Kurdistan in the Middle East in order to have an ally in the Middle East, an anti whatever, like also alien ally or something, non-Arab ally. So that has to be considered. And I'm not saying, the Syrian state traditionally, they appealed to the Kurdish idea of having a state, but within certain guidelines and in a certain way, not in the way that the US wants it to be.
Yeah, it all sort of harkens back to this Brzezinski doctrine of micro-states and mini-states also, doesn't it? This idea of having a separate nation for each different ethnicity and each different religion until the point that each state is so small and so weak that it can't resist corporate interests or banking interests or NATO interests. So that...
It's exactly right. And I think in some level, ethnicity and nation state, there's argument to be made there. But religion, I don't agree with that. It's not it's not what should be the identity of a nation state. Syria is pluralist and always has been, but the ethnicity of a Christian as opposed to a Muslim isn't any different.
Absolutely. Yeah, I agree with you on that. Another question about the, I meant to mention this a second ago, but there is now a UN truce proposal that's being presented as well, where there is this idea of basically a ceasefire that's going to take place in Aleppo, where the government forces will cease their move forward, and the death squad forces will also allegedly stop firing on the government forces so they can get humanitarian assistance in. This was just announced today. Doesn't this come a little conveniently timed right when the government forces are about to retake Aleppo? Doesn't this happen
Yeah,
every single time?
I think it's very well observed. I mean, you would not hear the United Nations calling for a ceasefire if the rebels were about to completely conquer, every inch of the Syrian military areas. But that's what you're hearing on the other end of the line. This comes just in the wake of the rebels infighting between Jabhat al-Nusra and the US-backed ones, which they've been working alongside each other for all of these months and years, but now over the last 2 weeks they've been infighting. So it comes in the wake of that, and it comes in the wake of the near fall of Aleppo or the liberation of Aleppo by the Syrian army. And it could go either way. I mean, the truce in Homs, where basically the insurgents were given buses and taken out of the center of the city. Actually, that ended up in the Syrian military taking complete control of the area. So it's all about how you play the truce in the end, I think. Like, what are the terms of the truce? That is the result. And I don't think, at least I hope, Syria is not going to be, just weak and say, yeah, we'll have a truce. Why don't you go in and rearm the insurgents and, give them more men during the time of this truce under the cover of aid, which is what they have done in the past.
Yeah, and this is Assad has played his cards pretty well, but it as I said earlier, it's always convenient that they didn't call for a ceasefire when the death squads took it over, but they're calling for one
No.
now.
In
There's
some ways, yes, he has played his cards well, but in other ways, if I take a step back and I look at the result of the last 3 years, I see that Syria has ended up pretty much like Iraq, but it took 3 years to achieve what was achieved in Iraq over 10 years. So in some ways, yes, we're surviving. In other ways, it's clearly not a complete victory.
Yeah, that's certainly true. All right, I want to ask you at least two more questions. We've only got a few minutes left in the show, but the U.S. Bombing campaign against ISIS, the bombing campaign against terrorists that we created to overthrow Assad, and now we're allegedly bombing them. What do you make of this? Do you really think the United States is actually bombing ISIS?
I think that even since 2012, I was hearing voices in the newest administration that one day we might have to go in and fight Al-Qaeda in Syria. And, it's the perfect excuse for an intervention. Maybe democracy and regime change and weapons of mass destruction and chemical weapons, maybe the people don't swallow that as easily as they do fighting terror. It doesn't matter that only a year ago they were creating these terrorist groups. But I think of course the objective is not to fight ISIS. I mean to destroy ISIS, because why spend so much time creating it in the first place? And even even Obama said, and it was retweeted by the Department of Defense, that the aim in Syria is not to defeat ISIS, but to contain the areas in which they operate. Which means so long as they're in Syria and Iraq and completely creating chaos and instability there, then they're fine. That's the point of the bombing campaign. And also along the way to destroy Syrian infrastructure and oil infrastructure, as you and I wrote separately, with the same idea in mind, that ISIS gives a perfect excuse to destroy Syrian oil infrastructure.
Yeah, I think our articles, and I think maybe Tony Cartolucci of Land Destroyer may have mentioned this as well, but it seems that even a lot of the alternative media sees this and just automatically does a 180 and says, oh, well, we're actually trying to defeat ISIS now, and I just don't see it. I mean, we've bombed oil refineries, which didn't belong to ISIS. They belong to the Syrian government. I mean, ISIS didn't build them. We've attacked grain silos. For God's sake, that's Syrian infrastructure. And then we're going to complain about a humanitarian crisis where people don't have enough food, where you blew up the grain silos. This is why.
Exactly. Exactly. I think it's deluded and naive and wishful thinking to think that, oh, actually, ISIS is out of control. They created something that's out of control, and now they've taken a step back and they've realized the error of their ways, and now they're gonna fight it. I don't see how ISIS is any different from all the other groups that they're still supporting. So
Yeah,
no,
they're not. I mean, the idea is we've got reports where Basil Idris, right, one of the commanders of these so-called moderate rebels, said that they work with both Nusra and ISIS, and I think the Syrian Revolutionary Front commander Jamal Maruf, he said the same thing.
yes,
So they work together, and we can't forget that for to be moderates, this guy Abu Sakar was a Farouk Brigade member, right? And this was under the umbrella of the FSA, where he cut out a heart and ate it on TV. So, I mean, that's a moderate. It is moderate
yeah,
cannibals now. So,
yeah,
there's no. I don't see any difference between them at all, because we can give them a funny name with Greek goddesses embedded in them. I don't really think that really gives any credence to it. The Kobane situation. Why is this town, this little area, so important, or allegedly important?
Well, it's on the border with Turkey, and it can, be another supply route for both ISIS and the YPG, and the YPG being the Kurdish militias. And isn't it interesting that the war there is just dragging on? I mean, if we're really to believe that the entire world is against ISIS and the full might of the US military are coming down on them, on this tiny village, then why is it that they still haven't lost? Is it that God is really on their side? I don't think so. So clearly they have state backers, and I think that perpetual war, even in the Kurdish areas, might still be, something that some US policymakers want. Also, there's probably a bit of a conflict between what Turkey wants and what the US wants in the area. But why is it so important? Yeah, it's basically a supply route to both possibly ISIS and the Kurdish militias.
Yeah, and it's also convenient that the Kobani became overrun with death squad fighters right after the U.S. air bombing campaign began, and they left certain towns that were being bombed right before the airstrikes took place. I guess they had a crystal ball, that they just knew that these airstrikes were going to take place in these towns, and suddenly they reappeared in Kobani. That's these guys are lucky. These are the luckiest
It's
terrorists ever.
it's interesting. It's called Kobani in the media, but the name of the town is actually Ain Larab. If you went on Google
Yeah.
right now, you wouldn't find Kobani, you would find Ain Larab, and that just shows that basically they don't want it to be connected to Syria. That's why they've chosen the Kurdish name for the town. And I noticed that any coverage in terms of Kobani totally tries to avoid even mentioning Syria or the Syrian state or the Syrian government or anything along those lines.
Doesn't it
Um,
also mean Arab Spring in Arabic?
yeah, because like spring as in water spring.
Right, right. Not the
So
not the fake
yeah,
color
not
revolution.
fake spring. Yeah, it's quite funny.
Yeah.
Ironic.
I'm sorry. Go ahead.
Oh, yeah, no. It's just a complete double standard, and it just so happens that when Kurds are defending their town against ISIS, like rightly so, people support them in defending their town against ISIS. But when the Syrians defend their town against ISIS in the south of Syria near Damascus, nothing is ever spoken about it in the media. The Christian towns fighting back Jabhat al-Nusra, you never hear about support of them in the media, and that's because they're allied with the Syrian state.
Yeah, absolutely. And I mentioned, we were just talking about the coincidences that tend to happen. These just strange coincidences that benefit ISIS or the NATO agenda. This is the same situation where the United States was considering a bombing campaign, and then conveniently ISIS beheads an American journalist, and then we want the British involved, and the British are going back and forth. And then a British journalist is beheaded, and then the French don't want to get involved, so they behead a French journalist. And this is just, I mean, this is like a slapstick comedy routine, right? This is every time the West considers an action, the death squads come out and commit an atrocity that provokes support for that action. And just when the U.S. is considering, or Turkey is promoting, a no-fly zone, and everybody starts to wonder, hey, wait a minute, ISIS doesn't have an air force. ISIS gets an air force. ISIS gets planes. So
that was a very interesting piece of news, because at the time they were talking about how Turkey wants a no-fly zone in Syria, and then people pointed out, wait a minute, ISIS doesn't have an air force. Why would you need a no-fly zone to fight or defeat them? And suddenly they said that ISIS has an air force, which is ludicrous. I mean, they're not going to have radar systems and airways to use without being shot down, even petrol for the planes, but and parts for them. So it's a very ridiculous piece of news, and it came out at the timely time. With the beheading videos, we can't say that they're completely fake, or that these men weren't beheaded. They, even if the U.S. was benefiting from these beheadings, doesn't mean that they would be squeamish about beheading their own people. Furthermore, ISIS could be that stupid to think that beheading these men wouldn't do the opposite of what they claim they intended to do, which was to turn the U.S. public against their government. No, it's done the complete opposite. It's kind of given the justification the U.S. needed to enter Syria. It's given its more credence, and its people gave more support to the intervention because of these beheadings. So it's kind of it boggles the mind, why they would do this unless they're complete and utter idiots that wanted to did exactly what they didn't want to do. But one thing I do note about those videos is that they were pre-recorded. They were recorded maybe months ago. We don't really know, before they were put out publicly, and all at a similar time. And they're slowly being, released, but it's clear they were really pre-recorded. So again, the question arises, why now? And you gave reason for that. I don't really know, or I'm just stating the fact that they were pre-recorded, and people can make of that what they will. But it's clear, the last journalist that they still are holding, that they're now exploiting for media purposes, the British journalist who was actually in Kobane reading out the news, he's doing a really good job for them, and getting not of his own volition. The poor man, he's probably frightened for his life. Nobody would want to be in that situation, but he is doing some great work for them in terms of getting attention, and maybe that's exactly what the U.S. still wants, because after all, the arms that they're dropping in Kobane, some of those arms are getting in the hands of ISIS. The arms that they've given to the Syrian rebels have been sold to ISIS. And is that incompetence, or exactly what they plan to do? I don't think it's incompetence.
Yeah, I don't think it's incompetence either. And we should always ask the question that if we want to get these journalists back, why don't we just send John McCain to go talk to them? He's to the kidnappers. He's great. He's great friends with them. So, all right, Mimi, we're really just about out of time. Is there anything else you'd like to add before we end the show?
I think we've covered it all.
Yeah, I think we've covered a lot of information here, right? Let me give your website and information out again. The YouTube channel is Syrian Girl Partisan. You can subscribe to that. And your website is syriangirlpartisan.blogspot.com. The Twitter handle is Partisan Girl. And the Facebook page is Mimi Al-Laham, right? So everybody should go subscribe to the channels, friend her on Facebook and subscribe on Twitter, so however you do that. So, all right, Mimi, thanks for coming on the show. I appreciate it. I've had a great time talking to you. And ladies and gentlemen, this is Truth on the Tracks. I'm Brandon Turbeville. We'll see you next week.